One of the major differences between kids and adults is disease trajectory. On the left is a graph representing trajectory in patients with frailty. It's a so called dwindled trajectory you see in patients with dementia, where they have prolonged but certain decline over time. On the right, we have the graph of pediatric frailty. This is seen in kids with static neurological disease. You can see that it looks very different. There's a lot more ups and downs. If they get sick with a pneumonia, for example, there's a big decline, but then they can have a big recovery. Pediatric diseases carry more unpredictability for a few different reasons. Number one, kids have the ability to bounce back because aside from whatever organ system is involved in their disease, they're usually healthy. An 8-year old with brain cancer, for example, has normal cardiac function and healthy lungs. They may survive multiple codes because they have cardiopulmonary reserve. Compare this to an 80-year-old with brain cancer. They probably do not have normal cardiac function and healthy lungs, and we all know that the chances of them surviving a code are very slim. Number two, there's a lot of rare disease in pediatrics. One large study showed that 41% of kids receiving palliative care from hospital based palliative care programs had genetic or congenital conditions. Many of these conditions are rare, or the diagnosis may not even be known. So, how do you know the trajectory of a disease whose N is very few, or even one? Number three, the disease trajectory in pediatrics can be much, much longer than what we are used to. In the adult world, a long trajectory is years. With kids, it can be decades. Some kids getting palliative care will live well into adulthood, so you may work with parents who have been caring for their child all their life, and now they have to worry about who will take care of them when they're gone. In some ways, this makes our job easier because we have a lot more time with families. In the adult world, especially when the prognosis is very short, things can feel rushed. You hardly know the patient, but you're helping them make some really tough decisions. It's much better when there's already an established relationship, and this takes time. So, because of all these differences, it's important to number one, get a lot of guidance from our pediatric colleagues about pediatric physiology and illness. Number two, prognosticate cautiously and humbly. And number three, not skip to the end. It's definitely a process for parents to acknowledge and plan for their child's end of life. If you're able to sit with them in uncertainty, they will trust you to help them make what seems like impossible decisions later on. These clips from Courageous Parents Network all show how parents deal with uncertain trajectory. The common theme, I think, is that they make preparations and take one day at a time. The first family has a daughter with leukodystrophy,
Early
and they have
on,
6 other kids.
when the doctor sat us down, got all serious, and said, all right, she has this issue with her brain, and here's what that means, and she might not live very long. And we go, we came home and really hashed that out and really thought about that. What does that mean? Like, is she going to die on this? Children aren't supposed to die before their parents. That's just not right, But it happens, and I said, how does that change us? What do we do? Do we focus on that? Do we think every moment, if she's sleeping and she's not really, you don't really see her chest going up as, obviously as other times you think, and we were doing it. Sometimes, did she stop breathing? What happened? And you never know. And that can just mess you up. So, we realized early on, we said, the fact of the matter is, we have no idea how it's going to happen, how it's going to look, or anything like that. Not only for her, but for any of our kids. For us. We don't know if we're going to survive the end of this day. So why really mess with that? Why really focus on that? Rachel may very well outlive all of us, and we have no idea, So we just said, you know what? Day by day. If the day comes.
In this clip, a mom of a child with type 1 spinal muscular atrophy talks about prognosis and how it changed when her son got a trach. This shows the wide variability of prognosis, even with the same disease in the same child.
I remember when he was about 1.5 years old, so he'd already been trached, but they had given us the diagnosis that as of 2 years old, that's kind of like his deadline. I remember just getting upset randomly, and I'm like, what is wrong with me? And I realized that I felt like I had like a clock ticking down in my head, like, oh no, I only have 6 months left. I only have 5 months left. Like, so I ended up emailing the neurologist and I said, okay, when you gave me the diagnosis, or when we got the diagnosis, this is what was said. Now that he's been trached and is on a vent, does that change that diagnosis? And he said yes. He said now that he's trached and on a vent, he could live a very long time. And that's where I left it. My cousin asked me, she said, well, what's a very long time? I said, I don't want to know. I don't know what, I don't want to know what his idea of a very long time is, because then I'm going to have that clock ticking down again and be worried and stressed. And just like any of us, we should be trying to enjoy every day that we have, because none of us know.
This is a couple whose teenage son has mitochondrial disease. I think it's interesting because it shows the very different ways in which each parent deals with uncertainty.
He stopped eating about 6 years ago. He stopped walking independently probably when he was, I don't know, 7 or 8. So everything, again, has come in phases, and he's, they can't really give us an answer as to what's going to happen. Some periods are worse than others. He'll go through a month or two of being really sick, and we have said a dozen times over the years, this is it. This is really it. We think this is the problem. We've created a DNR with a set of his doctors, which sounds so hard for me. It wasn't very hard for me. I'm very action-oriented, so unlike John, who doesn't really like to talk about the prognosis and his end of life, I want the DNR filled out. I went to the cemetery and picked out a plot. I'm thinking about his funeral in my mind all the time, which sounds so strange, but it's my way of sort of preparing myself for it, whereas John doesn't like to do that. And the prognosis, it's just unclear, which makes it a little bit harder. If they had said, you know, I think statistically, kids with mito, 80% of them die by the time they're 20 years old. His physician who treats him for that has a handful of teenagers in his practice. And when I asked him why, he said, there just aren't any, which startled me. I remember, I have moments where I'm startled by that type of thing, but he's 18, and you know, he could get sick and pass away in a month, or he could still be here when he's 25, and we just have no way of knowing, you know.
I remember saying to physicians years ago, as in when he was 4 or 5, or you know, what is the life expectancy? Because I always did that from I wanted clarity with regard to a plan. Is, well, he won't live past this date, then I can say, okay, I can plan around this. There's a beginning and there's an end, and I can work towards those numbers. And I like to put a metric around something, and you can't. Mm-hmm. And I think that's frustrating. It frustrates me because I can't plan. And all these things we have had a conversation about. There is no planning. You're just there. You don't really know what tomorrow's going to bring, and tomorrow could be many more tomorrows, or tomorrow could be tomorrow.